longer receive that 10% subsidy. Only 20% of, to put it in perspective, only 20% of Canadians are primarily policed by the RCMP. So they are actually only 20% of the population are receiving those subsidized policing services. And in 2022, both the Prime Minister and the Federal Minister of Public Safety issued mandate letters requesting that the status of RCMP contract policing be reviewed. So as I say, it's very much a topic of conversation right now nationally.
So we extracted some of the graphs from within the report for review this morning. There's certainly, or this afternoon, there's certainly additional graphs within the report itself, but this highlights some of them. The first one up is the Crime Severity Index as it compares to some benchmark municipalities that were identified. The benchmark municipalities were identified in that they represented demographics, geographical locations, mid-sized city challenges related to social disorder, homelessness, those sorts of things that are similar to what may exist with Grande Prairie. As you see here, what the red highlights are not specific just because they're higher. The red highlighted columns are Rcmp jurisdictions, whereas the blue ones are municipal policing jurisdictions. On weighted clearance rates, so what a weighted clearance rate is, these are again are Stats Canada data points that are publicly available, but a weighted clearance rate, so that's where the file has been cleared by charge or other means. So a higher weighted clearance is a positive indicator. One of the things that we wanted to provide some benchmark comparison to was annual calls for service. The reason specifically Brandon and Medicine Hat were pulled together from that larger comparator group is both Brandon and Medicine Hat Police Services encompass the peace officers or by law enforcement officers for those communities, which is similar to what we're pulling together here for Grande Prairie. So when you see the Grande Prairie calls for service number, that's a combined total of the calls for service for both enforcement services and the RCMP collectively. What you see here is the Brandon Police Service, although their community is about 50,000 people. In 2021, they exceeded the number of calls for service that we did in Grande Prairie. Yet in previous years, they were about on par. Medicine Hat's pretty consistently slightly lower than Grande Prairie. Where some of this is relevant is on the policing resources chart. So policing resources is broken down into 3 separate columns and 4 columns in the graph. The first column to the left represents the total policing personnel. So total policing personnel will consist of both the number of police officers per 100,000 people, the number of civilian personnel per 100,000 people, and then the number of special constables / peace officers. You'll see in the Grande Prairie context that Grande Prairie does have a higher proportion of civilians and peace officers, which is a strategic decision that we've made, which results in the overall volume of total policing personnel for this purpose exceeding that of both Brandon and Medicine Hat.
Okay, so part of the review was to consider and lay out alternative delivery models for policing services within the city of Grande Prairie. One thing I do want to point out before I move into the alternatives is there are recommendations within the report that should the city continue with the RCMP contract, which is an option, then there are recommendations built within the report to say if that was a decision, then here's some recommendations to make some improvement, primarily in the area of oversight and accountability and operational performance. So moving on to the Alberta Provincial Police Service delivery model option, so contract policing by the Provincial Police Service as opposed to the RCMP. There's a great deal of documentation on this proposal by the Government of Alberta, very comprehensive documents, so we're not going to repeat all that's in those and just pick some of the highlights. There is a intended focus on community policing by the Provincial Police Service, as well as an enhanced response to mental health and social issues. That is recognized that police officers aren't always the right response to incidents such as those. and a geographical distribution of specialized policing services outside of the Edmonton and Calgary hubs. So they're very centralized right now. What I mean by specialized services are things like the tactical teams would be an example. The intent of the province is to push those out outside of the hubs within the province. It includes a tiered governance model, so a provincial commission as well as local commissions. Certainly, the provincial commission will set budgets and policing priorities overarching, and then there are local commissions to feed up for local needs for policing. It's stated throughout the documentation the intent of the provincial service is to focus on enhancing policing in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. The focus is not urban municipalities such as the city of Grande Prairie. The GOA have made a commitment that there'll be no increase to municipalities for adopting the provincial police model over the RCMP model. And there is no timeline right now for either the decision or implementation. I think it's fair to say that the timeline required for implementation, establishing the provincial police service after the decision made will run into 2 years. So it's not known at what point this will become an option for the city of Grande Prairie to address its policing concerns. Another model that was considered is the regional police service. It's recognized that there are efficiencies to be gained by pooling policing resources and policing a larger area, number of communities with those resources. However, under the existing provincial police funding model, there's really not any incentive for the county, for example, who do not pay for policing to enter into a regional police service agreement with the city of Grande Prairie, because they will actually have to pay 100% of their policing costs.
And just to clarify on that, because I know there's probably some sensitivity there, the county does pay a cost related to policing, but policing of the provincial rural areas. What I mean by that is the non-urban components of the county of Grande Prairie have a different funding formula, and it's certainly not at 100% cost, which this model would trigger.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we did look at was the hamlet of Claremont and being an option to enter into a regional police service agreement. But essentially what you would create is a policing island where you'd have the hamlet police potentially by the city of Grande Prairie regional police service, but surrounded by the provincial police service, be that provincial police service or the RCMP. And there's a lot of complexity around bringing together a number of communities that will be similar in many ways, but as different in many ways, each with their own thoughts on what policing should or should not look like and should or should not encompass. And it will be very complex, to say the least. And one of the concerns is that that will delay any ability to implement a new police service for the city of Grande Prairie. So moving on to the last option that was considered in detail, and that's the municipal police service for the city of Grande Prairie. There was a number of benefits identified through the review of that model, one being local accountability and the fact that there will be a police commission. And it could be argued that police services really should be accountable to a local body such as a commission, and certainly a municipal service would afford that architecture. City will have control over its policing, through the commission, I should add, will have control over its policing priorities. So there'll be that direct local input as to what is important to the community from a policing priorities perspective. And control over the budgets, in that the city will allocate its policing budget, so therefore we'll be able to project, forecast, and allocate its policing budget. And then the commission itself will allocate that budget within the service, and then we'll have oversight as to the expenditures as to how that money is being spent. Staff retention is anticipated not to be the same challenge that it is currently with the model. We spoke to a number of municipal services, and the majority of municipal police service members spend their careers within that community, within that one service. The fact that there is that local accountability through a commission, the fact that members do stay within the service and within the community affords a strong community policing focus model. an increased efficiency in the fact that the model that's being explored and is copied within the report actually fully integrates those other enforcement and support social welfare services such as outreach and bylaw and the community peace officers. They're actually fully integrated within the police service model. Certainly from the discussions we've had with a number of chiefs, that's seen as the way forward in policing. And the longevity of the police service, there would not be the same concerns around longevity that are currently existing with the Rcmp, with the discussions I referenced earlier around the future of contract policing. Municipal police service won't suffer from those concerns and reservations about its longevity.
So with all that said, this is a summary of 120 pages of a detailed police service report that I know council's had an opportunity to have, but certainly will take some time to digest. However, what administration is respectfully recommending is that council authorize up to $250,000 for the development of a detailed transition and community engagement plan to further assess the opportunity to establish a municipal police service for the city of Grande Prairie. So we see this as phase one of a multi-phase process to really truly assess in a meaningful way what the opportunities are for the city of Grande Prairie. And policing, this is a rare opportunity in time where policing does represent not only the largest annual expenditure for the city of Grande Prairie from an operating budget, it also has very significant implications on the quality of life our residents and visitors to this community face, as far as how they feel safe. And it extends to things such as the economic viability of the community as well. So we believe it's prudent to continue the diligence that's been initiated and see it further. I, just by way of conclusion, will just sum up that what we would envision a transition plan including is really having a third party assess the necessary regulatory planning, community engagement, staffing, equipment, training, records, technology, operational steps. This is really not just a report that would indicate another high-level analysis to say there's opportunity here. This is the detailed A to Z on how to operationalize a police service if it's so chosen to do that. It's not a decision to do it today. And with that, we're happy to take questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your presentation. I see the queue filling up. Just a couple comments for council and for those who may be watching. This full report, the police service review report, is available online for anybody who is interested to review it. A reminder to council that if there are questions on labor or contracts, that we can save those, and I'll open an opportunity for an in-camera discussion if people have a couple building up that are not appropriate based on the in-camera expectation. And really today is not to debate or discuss the merits of this. It's really to talk about whether or not council is interested in having entering into an engagement process to consider this. So with that, I'll open the queue. Councillor O'Connor.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Clayton. Wonderful report. I didn't quite even get through all of it, and I spent 3.5 hours reading it, and I was trying to read as fast as I could. However, some things that I did notice that are a huge concern for me, and I'll start with a positive first. I really like the direction of going with a local municipal police. I think it's beyond time that we need to take care of that and do it now, sooner rather than later. However, my concern is the level of crime on your statistics. You showed that is the level of violent crime, sexual assaults, and I have to ask this question. Are we the drop-off point in the north for anyone that's coming out of prison and a halfway house? Because it just seems odd that we have such a high level of these types of crime compared to other cities across the country. That's my first question.
So in response to the question through the mayor, we can do further analysis specifically around that. What I can say is that within that report, we didn't provide all of the charts for all the surrounding communities, particularly in the north. I can say there is communities that have even significantly higher rates than we do. They just may not be large enough to be what we would consider a benchmark community. As a regional hub, though, to some extent, you are a destination for health services, you're a destination for justice and those sorts of things. So it's not without any merit. For instance, you're going to see a higher likelihood of those instances in Grande Prairie than you're going to see in St. Albert.
Okay. And so my follow-up, Madam Mayor, is if the RCMP are using this as a revolving door of officers with 2.87 years experience, when you're dealing with very organized criminals, wouldn't you want your best officers to be able to deal with those types of crime? And we're better off to have more seasoned officers. And I think our community would be in a safer place. Am I wrong in my thinking?
Director Manuel.
Yeah, through the mayor, what I will say in regard to the RCMP is completely appreciate the Grande Prairie context, and we're looking out for our local community. That being said, the RCMP, when they look at staffing, they have to look at how are they balancing out their staffing needs across all municipalities and jurisdictions in which they're policing. And it's a complex formula with a limited number of resources. I think in an ideal world, they would love for everybody to be a seasoned, experienced police officer in the city of Grande Prairie. The reality to it is they have to risk manage it to some extent. And there's, the officer that's working one person on a shift in a really remote location, that person has to be at a certain level of competency because they just don't have the support to lean on elsewhere. So they just have a challenging environment to work with.
Okay, thank you. I'll let somebody else jump in. I'll come in later.
I have a full queue. I'm going to go to Councillor Thiessen next, and then I'm going to go to Councillor Blackmore.
Thank you very much, Mayor Clayton. Just to supplement for Councillor O'Connor there, I have lots of friends and family in the RCMP. Some of them are high-ranking police officers. Some of them are detectives. And as Director Manuel stated, it's a risk mitigation process, especially upon when they're trying to get the conviction, when they have the people in prison and those people are required to testify. So there are provisions the RCMP makes to ensure they're safe. So my question actually, now that I've just thrown that in there, recently we were at the Alberta Municipalities Conference. One of the leaders, Rachel Notley, announced to the crowd that if she was to take government, that we would close down these talks about an Alberta Provincial Police Force, and we would continue our contract policing with the RCMP. But there, on the table here is a $250,000 ask. So the only thing I didn't see was the timeline for that. Is this $250,000 ask for the upcoming budget cycle or for the next budget cycle when we know what's going to happen with the provincial elections?
Mr. Manuel?
So 2 points there. I would say that this report was primarily initiated because of the policing environment that existed provincially around the review of the Provincial Police Service. I would say where we've landed as a result of this report is that we should detach ourselves from the province in that provincial review. And what we're saying is that the report illustrates that Grande Prairie has its own unique circumstances that require its own unique approach. Certainly, we would look to engage and complement the province in whichever process they take, whether that's retain the RCMP or not to retain the RCMP. So I would actually say that our cart's not hitched to their horse, per se, and I think it's prudent to proceed regardless. Our ask is actually now because we think that the opportunity to continue assessing this should not stall out as a result of, I guess, provincial political matters, and that there's justification to do so.
Councillor Blackmore.
I have a couple of quick questions for Director Manuel. One of them is, for me, improvement of service is the most important thing that I'm looking for. And I'd asked Chris this question by email. I'm going to ask him again now so that he can reiterate it for you. Can you tell me, kind of in a nutshell, the differences between the model of service delivery you're considering and the traditional service delivery, and what the benefits are if we are able to put this in place?
Absolutely. So it's actually a really good question. I'm glad it was asked, because we haven't, within the report, for those that haven't had a chance to see it yet, we propose what we believe could be a modern approach to police services. And what's meant by that is, as we were collecting best practices, as we were traveling across and meeting with different chiefs of police, we posed the question, if you could start fresh, what would you do and why? And we actually heard a resoundingly consistent message as to the improvements that they would make. And primarily within them was that we have an opportunity to be free of some of the historical limitations that are preventing them from really rapidly moving forward with some of these changes, such as some have collective agreements that limit their ability to really implement new approaches and new resources. Others have just historical practices that are difficult to change. So one of the things that we're looking at is, one, a recognition that police in the criminal justice system are a necessary response to certain calls for service, but not the only response to calls for service. So what we actually envisioned is a policing service where half of the membership is actually civilian or civilian type positions, such as peace officers and outreach workers and mental health therapists and those sorts of things, that are responding in conjunction or in replacement of the policing resources based on certain criteria and risk assessment. Additionally, those are all housed under one operational command and given in equal footing. So one of the things that we mean by that is an approach to tiered policing, where we want the people that have the most capacity to be proactive and the ability to dig into more complex matters to be those highly trained, highly paid police officers, and leave things such as minor shoplifting, mischief calls, have a different level of response to those, utilizing things such as the peace officers, where right now we have it a little bit reversed. I would say the most proactive policing time we have in the city right now probably rests with our peace officer staff who are out doing traffic enforcement and those sorts of things. I would frankly like to see that flipped, where they're running call to call to call on low priority criminal code stuff within their authorities and training and in mandate, and relieving the police to be free to provide more in-depth criminal investigation, proactive patrol, those sorts of things. So at a high level, but what we're describing right now is really going to be defined better in a next phase with that detailed transitioning report, because two things have to happen. I think, one, the community ultimately has to describe the type of policing and public safety response they want to see in the community, and the mechanisms in which, everything from how a call is received to how a call is triaged and dispatched. That information needs to be collected, and that's where the community engagement portion of the next phase comes in. And then we need to understand what are the real world operational and financial implications of what we're discussing. And again, that's going to be best analyzed at that next phase.
All right. Is that good,
So
Councillor
if I could
Blackmore?
I just have one follow-up question, which is not really related to the first one, but is one of the things that I've heard over time, I don't know if this is a valid truth or not, is that we always have a percentage of files which are closed but yet have not been cleared. So in other words, the crime hasn't been solved. Is our percentage of closed but not cleared files higher than other municipalities, or the same, or is that an entire myth? Or can you give me some direction on the truth and validity of that statement?
So that's actually a statistic that I don't have available to me right now, but it's certainly one that I could look to explore further and share the results with council. It's not one of the ones that's regularly reported through the crime statistics collected by StatsCan.
I'd appreciate that information. I think it tells a better story than some of the stats that we are getting. That's all I have. Thanks, Jackie.
All right. Councillor Bosch.
Thank you, Mayor Clayton. Thank you for this report. You know, I think this is high on our strategic planning in regards for our council, because we know it's a clear issue and top of mind for our citizens is the sense of safety and what we're going to do about that now and in the future. I think our timing is kind of harsh when the province is looking at, you know, a provincial police force perhaps, and that we need to be clear that that's not our intent. Our intent is to look at potential options for our city, and that we need to be very clear with that with the public. Mm-hmm. And I understand that approximately 50,000 people plus often do switch over to a municipal police force. So in doing so, is the reasons similar to ours, or maybe I'll just ask this question. For the new officers that come here, and then our total officers that we have, what is the percentage of new officers, let's say less than 2 years, in comparison to seasoned officers?
So to answer that question statistically, as was mentioned earlier, the average length of service for the constables in the detachment is 2.87 years. This is in June, I think it was, 67% of the were new to the detachment in the past year, and 50% of your frontline patrol members have less than 1 year's service in the RCMP. So a very inexperienced frontline workforce.
Right. Okay. I believe I did know that, but I need that to be public because that is an issue that we're looking at as a whole, right? Is this experience piece, this attraction and retention, the retention piece. And then I'll just ask one more question if I may. With the calls to service, it is my understanding that roughly about 45% of those calls to service that the RCMP do take could in fact be held accountable to enforcement services, mobile outreach team, security. Can you tell me if I'm like in the ballpark?
You're in the ballpark. So of the calls for service received, certainly not all of them are fully criminal in nature, and alternative responses actually often do occur, and sometimes those occurrences are just kind of counted in two places, but other times the policing resources deployed to something that maybe an alternative response could be. I think we'll get, again, a way better analysis of that and what the opportunities are in that next phase. But you also triggered something. So you asked a really good question, which is a question about the average length of service in the city of Grande Prairie. But the benchmarking we've been giving you, one of the ones we used is Medicine Hat. And I just happened to pull up their annual report now because it really stood out to me. And I'll give you the breakdown from Medicine Hat on what their average length of service is. So number of officers with less than 2 years of service. So Medicine Hat has basically the same number of police officers as Grande Prairie, slightly more actually. But they have 8% have less than 2 years of service. 10% have less than 4, or so 2 to 4. 5 to 9 is 10%. 10 to 19 years is 64%. And 20 plus years is 19%.
So just to confirm, that is a significant issue for me. Where we lie in those numbers in comparison, I think our citizens deserve not that new people aren't needed, and the training is there, but we ourselves, if our crime index is as high as 179, that's not okay. And so we need to look at that in our backyard, right? So, thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Bressi.
Great, thank you. Definitely something that jumped out at me when I was reading the report, and also Mr. Manuel mentioned it at Police Advisory Committee last night, was page 68. There's a couple graphs of arrests and charges and crime severity index. And it was really interesting to see how far out of line both our community and other RCMP police communities are on both the severity index and how many criminal charges are laid when they're relatively in line with the actual arrests that happen. I'm just wondering if you could share, what are your takeaways from looking at that?
So that was a statistic that, again, came to light. Those are usually two separate charts. So one chart shows the number of criminal occurrences, and then the other chart shows basically the number of individuals arrested. It wasn't until those two charts just lined up next to each other that I made the observation that I made, that there seems to be a different approach. And, well, I guess it's the administration of how policing is done between those municipal services versus the RCMP. I would say at this point, it's preliminary. Further analysis would have to be done to, at the onset, it essentially looks as though you have Grande Prairie and Medicine Hat within that report, as well as Brandon and others, that essentially have around the same number of individuals arrested. But it appears as though within the Grande Prairie context and some of the other RCMP jurisdictions, that the number of charges that those individuals carry is multiples versus singles, or something less than the same volume. So I would say more analysis has to be done around that, but it is certainly something for follow-up.
And am I right in understanding the crime severity index is based on charges, not another metric?
So it's a weighted. So this is one of the things. It's for instance, a homicide carries an exponentially higher rate than a bicycle theft, right? As it should. But yes, it's based not on number of individuals arrested. Again, it's based on charges. So presumably, the more charges, the higher the crime severity index.
Yeah, it definitely is interesting for me. I mean, we are always getting beat up over our crime severity index, and it really is interesting to me that there's some evidence that I'm looking forward to exploring more, that it really might just be a bureaucratic, how things are calculated and administered. Because I've never thought that our city's actually less safe than other communities, just from visiting and being around and talk to people that have been in multiple cities.
Well, as you pointed out within the report, we actually arrest less individuals than some of our comparators.
Councillor Berg.
Thank you, Mayor Clayton. Very thorough report, 120-ish pages. So I read it, and I saw that there was a lot of positives all the way around, which raised about a dozen questions that I had around potential implementation. So I actually think those 12 questions may have to wait for the next phase. I'm not going to throw those out now because they are around implementation. So I'm going to try to focus two questions on the $250,000 ask. One of the things, and we are familiar with you both, but for the citizens of Grande Prairie, can you guys both just briefly describe your resume and the level of expertise that went into this report and then into the recommendation?
Yeah, certainly. So I can lead that off. So obviously, Chris Manuel, I'm presently the city's executive director of emergency and enforcement services. Prior to that more recent role, so that role encompasses overseeing the city's Rcmp contract, our Rcmp municipal employees, the enforcement services department, the mobile outreach program, Grande Prairie Regional Emergency Partnership, as well as the Grande Prairie Fire Department. Most recently, I also had community social development, which includes housing and homelessness. Prior to that position, I was for approximately 8 years, I was the department head for enforcement services, as overseeing bylaw enforcement, the peace officers, animal control within the city. Worked very closely with the detachment management team. And then prior to that, I was with the Alberta Law Enforcement Response Teams, where I was seconded from the provincial government as a sergeant and an investigator with the Alberta Sheriffs, concentrated on organized crime investigations, drugs, prostitution, gangs, those sorts of things. And then prior to that, I was with the larger Alberta Solicitor General Public Security Division with the Sheriff's Branch, again as a supervisor, overseeing around 30 sheriffs, and have post-secondary education in criminal justice, and have been at this now for about 20 years. As the accent gave away, I'm not from these here parts originally, from the UK. I spent 14 years policing in the UK. To put it in Canadian terms, both national and municipal policing. My national policing experience was on the National Crime Squad initially, which is the National Crime Agency, and spent a majority of my service in something called Special Branch, which is primarily counterterrorism and national security operations. I moved to Canada in 2002. I did some private sector corporate security work, and then in 2006, I joined the Sheriff's Branch. I wasn't a uniform member, but I joined as a frontline member in an intelligence role. And then I moved up through the organization, and in May 2015 became the chief of the Alberta Sheriffs, and I served as chief for 6.5 years. Prior to that, I missed a little bit. I was over in Alert as a director in Alert, the Alberta Law Enforcement Response Teams, before coming back to the Sheriff's Branch as a deputy chief, and then, as I say, got promoted to chief in May 2015, and served as chief for 6.5 years. The Sheriff's is actually the third largest law enforcement agency in Alberta. So significant size, and now sits at, following some amalgamations, it now sits just under 1,000 employees within the organization. As chief, I sat at obviously the Alberta Association Chiefs of Police Executive and the Alert Board with my fellow chiefs of police, and certainly have those acquaintances and relationships with chiefs of police in Alberta.
Okay, great. Thanks, gentlemen. So my second question, and this is one that has come up more around the provincial shift, is cost to convert. If we invest in the $250,000, I have to believe that cost will also be part of that report.
So that's one of the key factors of that second phase, is the detailed costing that would be necessary for both startup, transition, and ongoing operating. It's the startup and transition that are the biggest bite to have. The ongoing operating, it's, again, that's completely within your control. There's not so much the duplication of having both services during a transition period. We believe that this is where the timing of being aligned with the province around the discussions that they're having right now has benefit as well, because if the province pursues ahead with a provincial policing model, they're going to face startup and transition costs for this community. We've initiated those high-level discussions already. This next phase will see a further determination as to whether there's any provincial commitment to assist us with such transition before a decision, or before the final report would be brought back to council for assessment. That would be a known factor, and something that would likely heavily influence whether a recommendation could be made.
Great. Thanks, gentlemen. And I'll save my next 12 questions for the next round.
Thanks for that, Councillor Thiessen.
Wow, I didn't think it would get back here real quick. Yeah, so I guess right along the lines with what Councillor Berg was talking about. So obviously, to go a municipal police force, part of that detailed analysis, I'm willing to wager that in order to go it out on our own, the Alberta Police Force isn't going to, the provincial government isn't going to make any grants available to us to go out on our own outside of the Alberta Police Force, or have they intimated anything like that?
I would say at this point, high-level discussions have been initiated, and there's certainly an audience that we have. I think in the coming weeks and months, we'll have greater clarity around what opportunities exist there.
Okay, and if I may, just a couple more. So some things that I am a little bit concerned about, besides like how we're going to take on the extra cost potentially, but even training, like if we're not allowed to use Alberta training facilities or the RCMP training facilities, it might mean that we may have to create our own training facility here, which produces another cost to that, which is great because if we're training municipal police services, but that's very much a part of it. So this is more of a comment. My other question is when we go, if we move forward with this and we do transition away from the RCMP, what kind of securities does the city of Grande Prairie have in regards to the deployment of RCMP members near the end of that 2-year transition phase where we have to give our notice to the RCMP that we will no longer continue with it? And if we're still going to get members, so let's say we have like 25 members that all of a sudden get redeployed to Kelowna or somewhere in BC, are we going to get those staff, or will there be an opportunity for us to move our municipal police services in and have that rapport, I guess you could say, with the RCMP?
Mr. Manuel?
Yeah, so the greatest indicator of how that approach would occur is to look across to Surrey right now and seeing what's happening over there. So the way it works there is, you're right, it would be difficult for the RCMP to transfer people into Grande Prairie with the understanding that that could be for a limited period of time. So once the decision is made, if council went that direction, quickly a police commission would be established and the command hired. You would then start integrating a hybrid model where basically instead of a new RCMP officer coming into Grande Prairie, they'd be a new municipal officer, and you'd work within a hybrid environment for a transition period of time.
Awesome. So we anticipate no gaps in service.
Correct.
Councillor Bosch.
Thank you, Mayor Clayton. So my previous questions were basically around retention and experience. So the other concern I have is attraction. Labor attraction in any avenue of labor is an issue for all organizations. What are your thoughts on attraction for potential municipal policing?
So we certainly think that's an area that we're going to want to assess in greater detail in the next phase here. That being said, the city has some opportunities. So one, we would want to really identify why we'd want to be an employer of choice versus what some of the other alternatives exist for people. Two, a primary focus on recruiting local. The best chance of getting people to stay within the community, particularly the Peace region, is to keep them here in the first place. Having robust, one of the benefits that we're talking about with this tiered policing is you can bring people in at a less experienced level in perhaps some of our peace officer roles, for instance, younger, and develop them internally to give them the progression to move up within the organization. And that's a path that's proved really successful in some of these municipalities. The best benchmark I can use right now is our fire service. So the Grande Prairie Fire Department does not struggle with recruitment or retention. And frankly, I would benchmark the firefighters we receive in Grande Prairie against any applicants across this country. And you know, not all fire departments have that same success when it comes to recruiting and in retaining staff. So we would look to replicate some of the some of the success that the fire departments had in that regard. So it is something that we're going to have to be cognizant of. We're going to also have to show about what's different behind working for the Grande Prairie Police, if one exists, versus what's different in the RCMP. I can tell you one of the big ones is if you're going to go to be an RCMP officer today, you're in Grande Prairie, and you know, my son decides he wants to be a police officer and he wants to join the RCMP. He's going to depot. He's not an employee. He's not getting paid. He gets an allowance. He gets $500 a month, I believe, is what they get. But he gets an allowance, or sorry, no, $500 a week. Might be $500 a week, $2,000 a month. When he goes there, he doesn't know where in the country he's going to work, which province, which municipality. You have no idea until you're partway through. If they have a spouse, if they have kids, they're away from the spouse, they're away from those kids for, you know, up to, it's a sacrifice to make there. Where on a municipal service, particularly a municipal service, if we do offer local training here, which that is a possibility for sure, the local officers are paid day one as an employee of the police service. They have the potential to do local recruit training here where they can maintain that relationship with their family and kids during that training period of time, right? And they know that they're going to continue to live and work in Grande Prairie. Those are some of the factors that I think we would have to emphasize as positives behind coming here, in addition to the variety of other health and wellness initiatives that we would hope to see in a modern day police service.
So adding to that attraction piece that we're just talking about right now, can you just, for everybody's knowledge, explain what is happening with the RCMP and depot and the reduction in people wanting to get into that field?
So within the report, it covers off, and it's no surprise they're facing challenges filling classes. You know, it used to be, you know, 20 years ago there was a significant number of applicants versus the number of spots that they were going to fill with applicants. The reverse is true now. There's more spots than there is applicants, and it's something that, you know, they've made some significant adjustments to their recruiting processes. One, they're trying to make that time frame a lot shorter. It used to be, it was not abnormal for it to be 18, 24 months from when you applied to finding out whether you were going to training. They've shortened that window. I believe it's now sitting around 9 months with a target for it to be 6. But again, some of these local services, you know, Medicine Hat and stuff, they can run that in 3. It's just a different beast.
Okay. And my second question is the integration of, let's say it is municipal, but municipal mobile outreach enforcement services, there should be significant savings in, you know, the call center, the training center, by inclusion of all of the different capacities of enforcement. There should be savings in that, right?
So I think what would likely occur is you would see, so presently we have 104 authorized policing positions. So say we have about 27 people in enforcement services, plus we have an additional 12 or so over at mobile outreach. I think initially you likely start with that sort of configuration or close to it. Now, based on that collective response where you would have people responding, you know, one dispatch center that's sending everybody out, you then assess, do we need more on the outreach side? Do we need more on the policing side? Like, you adjust based. The problem we have right now is we're working off different data sets. We don't know how many of these calls are duplicate calls. Like, did enforcement, MOP, and the RCMP all count that as the same call? Because they're all in completely separate systems. So today that could be 3 separate calls, but it's actually the same call. Some of that stuff would be cleaned up, and then from there you really analyze what's the right configuration.
If I could maybe add to that, to answer your question, yes, we do anticipate operational savings, because you, right now, as we touched on, you're running multiple records management systems, incident reporting systems, dispatch systems, and certainly those, the intent is the organization will operate from one of each of those, and therefore that will result in a cost saving.
Thank you.
Perfect. Councillor Bressie.
Great, thank you. I know another number that really jumped out to me in the report was training costs. I know that's something we talked about the expensive training in the past, but on page 76 says that in 2021 we paid $300,000 for training. I'm doing my math right. That's about $30,000 per member. Is that part of an assessment that we give towards paying some training towards new members at Depot, or is that just continuing development for people that are already here?
That figure is actually the travel costs associated with the training, as opposed to the training delivery itself. That's the cost, because a lot of the training doesn't occur locally here in Grande Prairie,
Yep.
and the city pays for those travel costs elsewhere to receive that training.
So that's just travel costs. That's not even instructor fees. That's not even salaries for the members doing it. It's just over $30,000 per year to train for ongoing training.
300
travel.
300,000.
Or sorry, over $30,000 per member per year just for travel training. Wow.
Thanks for that. Councillor O'Connor.
Thank you, Mayor Clayton. Mine relates around, again, the training costs. And for the officers in the report, it identified that those under 1 year are not trained to their ability and have to be sent out. And we're paying for all those costs. Okay, I'm understanding that. So we're paying anyways. Then when it comes to equipment on the charts on pages 73, 63, 64, 65, all deal with the other equipment that we're paying for anyways. Over 4 years, the EQ plan is 1.6 million, give or take, I just roughly. On the IT tech plan, that's another, and that's over 6 years, 1.2 million. And then on police vehicles, it's for 2.5 million to 3 million. So if we're paying for that anyways, why aren't we doing it ourselves? Because I guarantee you, if we're paying for it, we could do our own and do it a lot cheaper. I am pretty sure.
So to answer the question, they provide us, those numbers come from what's called a multi-year financial plan. And as was mentioned earlier, the only real costing decision we have as far as the RCMP contract goes is to increase the number of police officers we have. So presently, we have an authorization of 104 that we would fund. And that 104, they tell us, cost us approximately $202,000 a year this year. So that $202,000 a year, they then further break that down to show us what that includes. Part of what that includes is those capital items that you're talking about. So they say, you know, X number of cars are required for this number of members, so let's divide that by 104, and that's the cost. So they provide us the courtesy of telling us that that's what the cost is, but other than understanding what the cost is, we have no say in that. If you want that say, you have to look at a different model. That's per person, and what that does, that takes into it. There is a reconciliation. So one of the things that is noted is Grande Prairie, when you get the inexperienced officers, they are paid less than the more senior officers are. Granted, like I said, there's additional expenses related to getting them trained up and those sorts of things. We do get a benefit from that. The city essentially gets money back because we had all these cheaper officers than experienced ones. But it's never been, in the time I've been in Grande Prairie here, have never heard council say, we're looking for the cheapest option. It's generally been, you know, how do we expand our policing investment and improve our outcomes? And that's the discussion to be had. How do we improve outcomes?
All right, Councillor Thiessen.
Thank you, Mayor Clayton. I think this may be my last question, but I saved the best for last because part of me gets really, really excited about change, and I know that this is a change that I've been talking about, and the only thing that's ever held me back from going, let's look into it, was the cost. But now that we're looking into it and we can review those costs, that's great. On the other hand, part of my unparliamentary language, but I'm scared shitless of change. So I guess my question for you gentlemen is so let's say council does decide to move forward and the city as an organization puts together our own municipal police force. What are the roles for the RCMP and or the Alberta Provincial Police in our community at that point?
No, that's a fair question. So regardless of what happens with the province or even with the city of Grande Prairie, the RCMP, well, it does actually depend on what the province does. But so say the province formed a provincial police service. If the province formed a provincial police service, the RCMP's role would be similar to what it is in Ontario and Quebec now, in that they would still remain, whether they would have a local contingent or not our decision. They may not. But there would be a federal policing component, people that are responsible for things such as national security. And, with the oil and gas industry and stuff, it's not unreasonable to think that there wouldn't be some presence of some sort, as well as immigration, passport, those sorts of things. Now, if they remained as the provincial police, or if there is provincial police, there will definitely be a provincial policing presence within the city of Grande Prairie, because this is going to be a hub area, right? So now it's possible that, Claremont, for instance, is going to develop their own policing detachment here at some point, and it would likely make some sense that they would expand out a, maybe some service center associated with that. But the point is, things such as Alert, which is present in Grande Prairie right now, the way Alert operates in a place like Medicine Hat or Lethbridge is it's a mixture of municipal police officers, the provincial police service officers, and then sometimes supplements from things like Canada Border Services or whatnot, right? Well, in the Grande Prairie context, what you would see is versions of those integrated teams. You would have municipal police officers that are working on integrated alert teams in conjunction with the provincial police, or so it may be the RCMP or it may be the provincial police. But generally speaking, the operational partnerships are pretty strong, and the RCMP get along with the existing city police today, and I don't think that would change under one of these models. Everything is generally personality driven. That being said, you did make a point that this is not a decision to be made lightly, and it's not one that we're suggesting anybody make lightly, despite the experience that we do bring to this and the work that we've done to date. Even Lee and myself, we truly do believe it's prudent to do a more detailed assessment and to bring in third parties to really provide that independent, arm's length approach to this. Even with Lee, one of the reasons we brought Lee in is Lee's based out of Edmonton, lives in Edmonton. He provided some outside perspective to this phase. We need to take that to the next step, right? And that's really what we're asking.
I just had a question before we go to Councillor Bressy. Early on in the report, you mentioned the costing model for administration, and that it's not dollars that are actually spent creating employment in our city or our region. Have you done any extrapolation of those numbers to see what that would equate to? Because I'm assuming it's a per member fee that equates to the $3.5 million for IT, HR, recruiting, etc. If based on a similar sized police force, do you have any consideration of what kind of employment that would create actually in our city with that administration component?
So yes, at a high level, for instance, within administration, we recognize the positions that we'd be looking to replace out of those monies are going to include things such as a human resources consultant, a finance coordinator, two IT specialists, a fleet coordinator. I want to say it was approximately 6 jobs.
So 6 full-time jobs. And so then that's in addition to any training, et cetera. That's truly just administrative supports.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bressy.
Great, thank you, Mayor Clayton. I got one more question to ask in a public venue, and then just so you know, I do have a labor question, so I would take you up on that opportunity to go on camera later when it's appropriate.
You bet.
But one other question I've got is, so right now we're just talking about creating a transition plan so we can fully consider whether we want to make future moves. So just honing in on that plan. Can you tell me a little bit more what this price tag would get us in terms of, and especially what I'm looking for is what kind of opportunities would council, what kind of opportunities would the police advisory committee, and what kind of opportunities would other stakeholders in the community and the public at large have to engage and shape this and be part of figuring out what the future of policing in Grande Prairie might look like?
Yeah, so the funding's primarily focused on three things. So there's the internal staff costs, so obviously keeping Mr. Newton on board to assist us with this process has some expense associated to it. Additionally, we see two consultants at play. One consultant primarily on the detailed policing operations side of things and assessing out what are really the A to Z on forming the police service. The other piece, which is hitting more on, I think, where you're going with it, is the community engagement communications portion, which is what's the specific comms plan on, one, how do we survey the community about, again, those things I touched on earlier, what are the specific needs the community has around policing? What's working well? What's not working so well? What's the future state? What do people want to see? That has to happen. I can tell you there's still some development that has to occur in consultation with council and the Municipal Police Advisory Committee about what touch points and what sequencing we would want to do, things such as survey, town halls, open house workshops, and then ultimately dissemination of the results of all that. We got some high level stuff sketched out, but it's still very much available to apply in whatever direction council wants.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, great. So you say to apply at the direction council wants. So I guess then if council did approve this transition plan going on, when would be the next checkpoint for council to see what that engagement is going to look like, to figure it out, to make sure that we're shaping it and getting what we hope to get out of that 250,000?
Mr. Manuel?
I think it's reasonable for administration to come forward to council with a community and engagement. So I think we have a really good idea on the transition plan side. I think we could come forward as part of regular committee business with what administration sees as the engagement process and milestones related to this, and look for council endorsement.
Great, thank you.
Councillor O'Connor.
Thank you, Mayor Clayton. I just went back and looked at the report on page 69, and I need to understand why the percent of events found to be unfounded in Red Deer, Prince George, Grande Prairie, and they seem to be extremely high, 10%. Prince George was 4.25 and 9% in Red Deer, and yet the average across the province looks like about 3% unfounded. Is there some thoughts as to what that is?
So through the chair, we can't tell you specifically why that is, other than it appears that there's a practice that's different in some form. It's going to take some further assessment and discussion with the Rcmp and frankly some municipal counterparts to see how they might be doing things a little bit different. But it is something that should require further discussion.
Yeah, and supplement?
Go for it.
Yeah, and so getting back to the transition, I know Councillor Pressey and a number of mentioned, you know, the 250 costs. This is where we're going, and we're, excuse me, look at it, a cost going forward. Is there a rough number of what that transition cost? And I know it's awfully early, depending on whatever. Is this, you know, like millions, 20 million? Roughly what direction would that take us?
Okay, so through the chair, we've done some initial costing at a high level as part of our project team. What I would say right now is that it is within the millions, for sure. likely somewhere in the 10 to 20 range. But that is what the next phase really has to drill into. There's a number of assumptions made regarding that we would want to have further assessed. So that gives you some context in that regard.
And if I could suggest, Councillor O'Connor, that might be a better in-camera discussion. All right. Councillor Berg.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Clayton. And again, this may be in camera. I think it's all public knowledge what I'm asking, though. We all agree priority one is having safer streets and crime reduction. When you using Medicine Hat as a comparable, what are we spending on police annually versus what Medicine Hat is spending on police annually? And the reason that I ask that publicly is I want to know, when you take a glance at it, yes, policing is number one, but let's look at the finances too. There has to be a simple justification at a glance as to why we would explore this.
Okay, well, if we're because we have used benchmarks on Brandon and Medicine Hat, on expenditures, so if you're inclusive, and we will be inclusive of the enforcement services budget as well, we're at expenditures of $30.8 million in 2021. Medicine Hat's at expenditures of $25.6 million, and Brandon is at expenditures of $18.8 million. On the revenue side, now automated traffic enforcement in Grande Prairie does go to offset policing costs here, but so do they in Medicine Hat to some extent as well. So in Medicine Hat, they have revenues of $4.4 million. Grande Prairie has revenues of $6.7 million. Now, that's all revenues, not just photo enforcement. That's things such as cell block and other fees that we get back from the province. And Brandon has revenues of 3.7. The net in Brandon is 15 million, 15.1. Grande Prairie was 24, and Medicine Hat was 21.1. On a per capita basis, Brandon was $295 per capita for policing costs. Medicine Hat was $335, and Grande Prairie was $375.
So using these as measuring sticks or benchmarks, there could be potential savings long term.
Potentially.
Thank you.
All right. So I now don't see anyone else in the queue. Before we go to business that may be arising, it's been up the whole time. So, sorry.
I'm in the queue.
Okay, go ahead.
Mayor Clayton.
Yep.
I am wondering, Director Manuel, the federal government has indicated that they are ready to look at contract policing across Canada. Do you have any idea if they're going to change the policing, like redesign policing, or do you have any idea of where they're going with that? And if you have any idea, what effect would it have on the city of Grande Prairie?
I think it's fair to say that the conversation when they discuss contract policing is whether they continue to provide it as opposed to significantly redesigning how they deliver it. I certainly haven't seen a discussion or materials yet around the redesign. The concern that we would have as a municipality is if that decision was made, it would have to be messaged ahead of the 2032 contract expirations. And the thing with the RCMP is all the municipal and all of the provincial contracts expire at the same time. There's no sequencing. If a decision is made to change, that change is going to have implications on hundreds of municipalities. And one of the concerns that our project team has had is we truly believe we need to be ahead of any curve. So we, much like we've done on the provincial review so far, and regardless of whatever approach council ultimately decides to take, our ear needs to be to the ground. And if something that's going to significantly impact the status quo of policing for our community right now, we need to be ahead of it, because if we're not, it's unlikely that Grande Prairie will get the attention that it deserves as part of any sort of transition. And we would have to compete with hundreds of other municipalities around, things such as resourcing and transition costs and so on.
All right. Is that good, Councillor Blackmore?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Right. I'm now going to suggest, maybe just by a raise of hands, if anybody thinks they have in-camera questions, raise your hand. And all right, so now I'll be looking for a motion to go in camera. And before we do that, are we able to get Councillor Blackmore a different Zoom? You did? Sweet, perfect. Okay, thank you. So, Councillor Bressie.
Thank you, Mayor Clayton. I would move that Council Committee of the Whole move in camera.
That motion is in order. I'll call the question. Councillor Blackmore, how do you vote?
Councillor Blackmore in favor.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Brooks in favor.
Councillor Thiessen in favor.
Councillor Bosch in favor.
Michael Connor in favor.
And Councillor Berg in favor.
Mine was the only one that worked. Nobody was on Nobody was. Oh, I was. All right. We'll take a 5-minute bio break before we start our in-camera discussion. portion. And we'll continue and look to business arising. Councillor O'Connor.
Thank you, Mayor Clayton. I would like to move that committee recommend council authorize up to $250,000 from council's Strategic Initiatives Fund to the development of a detailed transition and community engagement plan to further assess the opportunity to establish a municipal police service for the city of Grande Prairie.
So that motion is in order, and I will open for discussion or debate. Seeing no one, so this is a motion that committee is directing council for this discussion. This special council meeting will be held tomorrow at 10 a.m. It will be live and online as well. And with that, I see no Councillor Bressie.
No, thank you, Mayor Clay. Just for those watching, I do have some thoughts about this. I'm looking forward to more conversation. I'll be voting yes to this, though, without providing a lot of comments, because we're going to have debate tomorrow. And so it's not just rubber stamp this, moving this forward without debate. I just want to be clear.
Perfect. So as mentioned, this is in order for this discussion to go to a council meeting. This is this motion to support that. I see no one else in the queue. I will call the question. Please vote.
Councillor Thiessen in favor.
Councillor Blackmore in favor.
And that carries unanimously. So we will see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.